it or buy the music for it. And it becomes something that you can really bring everywhere, no matter where you go, because it's so portable it can just slip right into your pocket. Unlike the old Walkman with the CD or the tapes even, which even though they were fairly small and you could carry them with you, they were still fairly bulky. And all of us know that the cell phones we carry around today, smartphones that do a million different things, are much, much smaller than those old Walkmans. So an iPod is a disruptive technology that really takes the place of something that came before it. Now with the iPad, the reason that I haven't bought an iPad, I'm not really interested in an iPad because I haven't seen anything compelling to what it can do that would make me want to get one yet. But the concept of the iPad, as I have said many times in the Weekly Ringer, is what I love. And when I was watching the launch of the iPad, I was just as astounded as everybody else. Not because of the functionality in terms of what it could do at that moment, but in terms of the functionality as to what the possibilities were for the platform. Apple launches the iPad knowing full well that if they are successful in doing what they do, sooner rather than later, this device that they're holding up with the iPad will replace the notebook PC. It will replace the desktop PC. And if they do it right and they push it along, then they will basically initiate what we're now referring to in the technology industry as the post-PC era. And folks, we're there. I know you guys all know and love your PCs. I use one too, desktop and notebook. But the concept of the iPad, I think, is so good, and they did it so well. The implementation, again, is the key. It's not that there weren't notebook PCs before the iPad. There absolutely 100% were. The issue is that Apple, again, brought the user experience and brought the completely changed way of executing the platform so that people started to think differently about it. And I have always admired Steve Jobs, and I've always admired Apple for their willingness to invent a disruptive technology that might even put one of their own businesses completely under. And you have to have admiration for that, because most companies would never have the guts to do something like that. Steve Jobs did, because innovation and engineering were always at the forefront of what he was trying to do. And so cannibalization, I think, can't be underestimated, along with a just myriad of different corporate executive concepts that I could go into right now, but I won't because people didn't mention them. But there were so many different things that Steve brought into the environment with Apple Computer that I think is just spectacular and will always be remembered. One last one I wanted to mention, Jason Tayo, who I'm glad I got your name right, thank you, although I'm a little disappointed it wasn't Jason T, is the organ donation laws in California. You know, this goes to show something a little bit more about Steve Jobs as a human being. And I thought, although I don't have a lot of knowledge as to exactly how all of that worked, I think it's fantastic when somebody that has that kind of authority, that kind of power, can use that influence to do great things, like help people that need to get organs, because of an archaic donation system and mapping system and whatnot, help them get the organs they need to save lives. And I think that's just spectacular. And if you're going to look at Steve Jobs, the human being, and not just Steve Jobs, the CEO, I think you're going to have to look at that. So that's what you guys had said. I think most of the prevailing discourse, I'm kind of surprised nobody said the iPhone right off the bat. I know that Jojo Petro actually did mention the iPhone and the smartphone being a kind of concept that was revolutionized by Apple. Absolutely is. 100%. The smartphone really became something that was overly desirable when Apple really pushed the bar forward with the iPhone. So I think you could make that argument as well. So you guys ran through a lot of it. Now I'll tell you what I think. I think you got really the big ones that were there. There are definitely more. Here's what I'm going to say about Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is one of my heroes, and obviously one of the reasons I want to ask about this. And you can love Apple and hate Apple. And by the way, some of you had the exact same opinion as many people out there. You can't stand Apple, but you were certainly willing to bow to the performance of Steve Jobs. Eric Schmidt, the ex-CEO of Google, who is now the president of Google's board, who actually was on Apple's board up until they launched Android, at which point it became a conflict of interest. So that being out there as a full disclosure, Eric Schmidt said recently, just this past week, that the performance of Steve Jobs as a CEO is quite simply the best we've seen from any CEO in the last 50 years. I'm not sure how you slice and dice that, guys, but I think he's absolutely right. Steve Jobs fundamentally changed the industry that he was in, not just by calling different market trends in the future, which takes tremendous amount of intelligence and is fantastically difficult to do, but did it as a driver in the seat, as a person that pushed the incumbents out, sat in the seat and said, no, this is where we're going, and I'm going to make it happen, and it's going to happen today. Steve Jobs did that. Now, I love the story of Apple Computer. I love the cult of Mac. I'm very much a part of that, I would say. The Woz is a tremendous influence of mine as well. That being said, I'm not probably the same kind of a guy that's driving around, just out of college, or not even finishing college, like Steve Jobs did not do. Driving around in Silicon Valley in the late 70s, early 80s, just thinking that I've got the next biggest idea. Those guys had stones, and I absolutely tip my hat to them for that era. But the era that ushered in gave birth to the world of the internet that you and I know today. Now, while those guys maybe didn't invent it, although the Xerox company was mentioned, that is by and large the greatest contributor to IP networking, which is absolutely what you and I are using to talk right now. But basically, those guys blazed the trail, which I think is absolutely tremendous. And so Steve Jobs stepping down, the first time I saw the news that he was stepping down as CEO, I was just left my mouth agape. I just had no idea. It really is the end of an era. And I just hope that, first of all, I hope Macintosh prevails. I hope it continues, because I'm a huge fan of Mac. And always have been, and I hope, and always will be, unless they converge the iOS game. And by the way, iOS wasn't mentioned by anybody out there, but I think iOS could even be one of the greatest contributions, because it certainly fundamentally changed the way we do everything on the web, or for that matter, the way we actually interface with almost any consumer electronic device was revolutionized by iOS. Call it what you will, but that's what it is. There's really no argument about that. So that being said, what do I, now that I've given my unabashed admiration for Steve Jobs, which I do have, and I hope you guys don't mind that, I'd like to say what I think his greatest contribution is. I have to say that, from my perspective, Steve Jobs' greatest contribution to the world around him is the ushering in. He is the face of the ushering in of the era of consumer electronics and the internet as king. And not necessarily the PC era, although I think he is the father of that as well. I think Bill Gates probably has a little more responsibility for that, for obvious reasons. But I would say that the idea of the next greatest innovation in consumer electronics being the kind of hot, sexy idea that people were looking for in the future. How can we change our lives through the harnessing of technology? Apple did more, and Steve Jobs did more to bring that into our homes on a day-to-day basis than anyone else in the entire industry. And that, my friends, I believe is the greatest contribution to the world around us, because there are so many technological things that Steve Jobs started as an idea in his head or led as an initiative from his team that I can honestly say have changed the world. And how many people out there, CEOs or otherwise, by the way, kings, queens, whatever, right, can say, I had a hand in so many things that fundamentally changed the way that people live. And I just think that that is something that could not be overshadowed. As a CEO of a company, that is a very difficult thing to do. And I think it's something that is not... Steve Jobs is obviously a workaholic, which is one of the reasons why he couldn't handle his job anymore and had to step down. But guys, I think we have to bow our heads in admiration, just because he's done what nobody else could do. in that sense. And there have been many tremendous CEOs. I think Eric Schmidt is one of them. Bill Gates is obviously another one, even though he's not the CEO anymore and hasn't been for many years. But those guys are tremendous visionaries, but they still haven't touched as many changes in technology as Steve Jobs. So that's my opinion. That's what I think. But I think it's a great topic and one that we could go on and on about forever and ever. Sad to see Steve go, but I hope Mac stays intact, and I hope Apple and the way that they've run and the course that they've gone on stays continuously into the future. I think it's a great forecast. Apple doesn't look to be going anywhere anytime soon. So that brings us to the question for next week. And so I started thinking about this question of longevity, and I started thinking about, I wonder if Steve Jobs, when he was working with the Woz in their garage, making the Apple II, I started to think to myself, did they think in 25 years and 30 years that what they were working on would be remembered so fondly and would be so traceable in the technology that we see right now? And I started to think about that in terms of video games. Because I wanted to ask a question about video games this week. It felt like we had gotten away from that a little bit with a lot of consumer electronic stuff, and we always go with current events here in the Weekly Ringer. That's my number one modus operandi. But I wanted to ask about video games this week because I think video game questions inevitably are some of the ones that we have the most fun with. So I started thinking about longevity in video games, and I came up with this question that I want you guys to answer for next week's Weekly Ringer. And that is, what game or game franchise do you think people are going to be most likely to be playing in 25 years from now, right? So what game or game franchise will people still be playing in 25 years? And I ask this because I play a lot of games that are now 20 years old. Think of the Super Nintendo, getting close to its American, 20th anniversary. If it's not already there, I have to think about that. Anyway, but the NES, right? 25-year-old games that we still know and love and play all the time. So my question for you guys is, what games that are being made today, what game or game franchises that are existing today are we going to see in 25 years and have the same kind of impact on the video gaming industry that they do today? Can't wait to see what you guys come up with for this one. This one is wide open, and there are so many great answers and so many great things I think you could probably pull out for this one. So I can't wait to see all of you come out of the woodwork and tell me exactly what game you think is going to have the longevity of a Super Mario Brothers for the next 25 years. So that is the Weekly Ringer. Thanks to all of you for watching, as always. I hope you all have a wonderful Labor Day weekend. I am the Commodore from the clan of the Gray Wolf, and there is no reset button.